everybody.
Hi guys,
I'm Mrs. Dabrowski.
and I'm Mrs. Morsiglio, your Foods 1 teachers.
Yes, so today what we're going to actually be demoing for you is Southern Biscuits, and this is one of the recipes that we want to make together when we're in here, but since we're not, we figured a flipped learning style would be a good idea. So you're going to watch the video of the demonstration at home and hopefully come in and make the same recipe.
In the classroom.
Okay.
So first thing you need to do is take off any rings or any bracelets so that you can have clean hands. Take it over to the sink. Hand soap around the wall. And we wash for 20 seconds.
20 seconds, or the happy birthday song twice, or even the ABCs.
And you always use paper towels.
So there's a couple things we're going to go over today. Other than just making the biscuits, we are actually going to be teaching you some of the equipment you're going to be using in this class. And as you're watching this video, please make sure you're following along to fill out your part 2 of equipment on Google Classroom.
Okay, so the first thing we need to do is gather all of our ingredients together. You'll have a recipe, and we'll talk about how a recipe is broken down. And we start with measuring step number 1, which tells us to preheat our oven to 400 degrees. So you come over to your oven and you press the up button, bake, and then the up button, and you wait until it gets to 400 degrees. Preheating has to be done at least 5 to 10 minutes before you want to put your product in the oven.
Okay, so quickly we just want to go over and make sure we have all the ingredients out, and then you can also see what you'll be using if you decide to make this recipe. So the first thing is you're going to need 2 cups of flour, all-purpose flour. You'll need 4 teaspoons of baking powder. Okay, baking powder is generally the one in the small container, but you want to always make sure and not confuse it with baking soda. Okay, you're gonna also need baking soda, and like I said, you don't wanna confuse it with the baking powder, but you're gonna actually be using both of these today because they have different functions in this recipe. You'll need 3/4 of a teaspoon of kosher salt. Kosher salt has a little bit of a bigger grain than regular table salt, and we're gonna be able to show you that so you can see. If you're making this at home and you don't have kosher salt, it's okay to put a little bit of regular salt in. It's not going to change the recipe too much, but it is better to use the kosher salt for this specific one. For our wet or cold ingredients, we have our unsalted butter. And you can buy unsalted butter in the grocery store, or you can get salted butter. For this recipe, again, for substitution purposes, if you only have salted butter in your house, you may use salted butter. It's not going to change it that drastically, but you might want to limit a little bit of the salt that you're going to be putting in. And you need 1/4 cup of vegetable shortening. They say the key, the magic to the biscuits and making them super tender and moist is actually using shortening. So we're going to use that. And 1 cup of buttermilk, which we're going to show you how to make if you don't have buttermilk in your house.
Okay, so step number 2 after we preheat the oven is to place the dry ingredients into a large bowl. We have bowls that are called nesting bowls, meaning that there's 3 different sizes: small, medium, and large. And your recipe tells you to specifically put it into the large bowl. So that's the one we're going to be working with, so we can put aside the other 2 bowls because we don't need them. So the first thing is to measure dry ingredients. So we look up here and it calls for 2 cups of flour.
Okay, so as you can see, we actually put our flour into a one of these Cambros just to make it easier for measuring.
And there's a scoop in here, and you move the flour around to kind of aerate it so it's not packed in, and just lightly place your flour over mounding it into your dry measuring cup. Straight edge spatula is your favorite tool for measuring. You can just go over it a little bit and then level it right off, and now you have an even cup. And that goes into our large measuring bowl. And again, it calls for 2 cups So I'm going to do this a second time and level off. And there's my 2 level cups of flour.
Okay, and you want to always make sure when you're done with an ingredient, you put it off to the side and close it, so you know you've already added it and it's also closed, so nothing can get into it.
Second dry ingredient is baking powder, and the third one is baking soda. These are both leavening agents, which are going to cause your biscuit to rise in the oven. So the baking soda calls for 1/4 of a teaspoon. There's 4 measuring spoons that we have here, okay? And we'll learn about that when we do our measuring. And right on the little arm, it tells you 1/4 of a teaspoon, so you don't have to guess. Again, you take your measurement, mound it up, straight edge spatula, level it right off. Now I like to put my ingredients in different parts of the flour so that you know that you measured them already. The next one, it calls for 4 teaspoons of baking powder. Teaspoon is a little bit larger than your 1/4 of a teaspoon. Built-in leveler here, I don't have to use this. So what I would do is mound it into my spoon, level it off, and put it on this side of my flour. Somebody counting for me, I hope. 3, 4. So now I have my baking powder and my baking soda. And the last dry ingredient to put with the flour is kosher salt. It calls for 3/4 of a teaspoon of kosher salt. If you don't have kosher salt at home, kind of only put maybe like 1/4 of a teaspoon, because this is more potent in flavor than kosher salt is. Now, 3/4 of a teaspoon. I have a tablespoon, I have a teaspoon, a 1/2 teaspoon, and 1/4 of a teaspoon. So if it says 3/4 of a teaspoon, how many times we're going to measure this? So again, I will open this up. If you find that you can't put the spoon in there, you can hold it over a container and level it off. And that's 1. Somebody counting for me, I hope. And that's 2. And that's 3. Now when we get into measuring, we will learn that I really don't have to measure this 3 times. I could have used 1/4 of a teaspoon and a 1/2 teaspoon, and that would have equaled 3/4 of a teaspoon. But that's in another lesson when we get to measuring.
Okay, so dry ingredients. We're gonna put those off to the side as we prepare now our wet ingredients. We have 2 tablespoons of unsalted butter.
Okay, so, and again, if you're using regular butter that has salt, you can reduce your salt. Nobody says you have to run out and get unsalted butter. And if you notice, unsalted butter is a different color packaging, and you will see that no matter what kind of butter you buy. Now, on here, there's lines. So it's telling you exactly what part you have to cut off. This calls for 2 tablespoons. 8 tablespoons in a stick of butter, so I only need to cut off 2 of them. And there's my 2 tablespoons of butter. And this I can put away.
When making biscuits too, you always want to make sure whatever fat you're using is chilled. So our butter was refrigerated as well as our shortening, and it's nice and cold for the next step of our recipe, which we'll explain.
Okay, the next one is shortening. Crisco is a name brand for shortening. ShopRite makes their own brand, but it's called vegetable shortening. And you need to have 1/4 of a cup of vegetable shortening. Again, you have measuring cups here, no guessing, written right on the little arm which one we have to use. In this case, it's our red one. And you use what is called a rubber scraper. You might have different names for it at home. They come in different looks, but we're going to use the smaller one. You take your shortening out and you pack it into your dry measuring cup. And you just keep packing it, taking it off the sides. And whatever you don't use, you can put back into the container. And now I have my level 1/4 of a cup of shortening.
Thank before.
Mm-hmm.
You also could use this rubber scraper now to get the shortening out of the measuring cup, which will really help get into all the divots and corners. So you get every last bit. Okay, for our next tool, this is one that's fun to explain because most of you have never seen this before. This is called our pastry blender. And if you look at it, it looks like it's sharp, right? It looks like it has a bunch of little sharp edges on here, but really it's actually just to cut in the fat into your dry ingredients. So in this case, we're going to be cutting in the butter and the shortening, which is our fat, into our dry ingredients mixture. The purpose of this and the end result goal is to have this whole mixture look almost like breadcrumby. That way you know that you evenly distributed the fat throughout the entire mixture, okay? So a good way to do this,
You want me to do?
yeah, sure.
No, you do it up at.
A good way to do this is always use maybe a small rubber scraper or your straight edge just to help you get the butter and the shortening out.
Mm-hmm.
Because once you start pushing down and cutting it in, you'll see it gets a little stuck. So you just want to kind of push it out from the crevices and keep just cutting it in.
Mm-hmm. And cut in is a term that's on your recipe, and we use that term a lot when we do anything that's in the biscuit family, whether it's biscuits or scones, or what's the other one we use for that?
We cut in the topping.
The topping, when we
For
do a
apple
crumb,
cake.
when we do a crumb topping, we use the pastry blender.
Right.
So we'll be using it for a lot of different reasons. And you might have one at home.
Yes,
Check
so
your
if
drawers.
you don't,
Right, if you don't, you can use 2 knives and just keep cutting them in an X fashion, and that will serve as the purpose
I
of
actually
it.
don't have one of these at home. So when I make these recipes, I do use the 2 knives and I just cut
Mhm.
almost like in a scissor fashion. I cut the pastry or the butter into it this way. And it essentially does the same thing. This is just a little easier.
Yes, it is.
All right.
Okay, so then the next part of our recipe is telling us to make a well in the center. So we can use the rubber spatula, and it tells us to pour the buttermilk now into the center or the well. Or you can call it a hole, but you kind of push your dry ingredients up to the side. Now, buttermilk, we have liquid measuring cups. These are dry measuring cups. Anything that has a little spout on it will be something that you measure that can be poured out. These are for dry ingredients. Now, buttermilk, you can purchase buttermilk at the supermarket. It says buttermilk on it, or you can take whole milk and some vinegar and make your own buttermilk. The reason why you can use these 2 items is because it needs the acid in vinegar to react in here to cause your baking soda to rise. Buttermilk is always nice and rich. However, you don't have to run out and buy it. You can use that, and we'll put on the screen the recipe for
Yes.
substitution.
You can also use lemon juice.
Yes.
Any type of like acid will work, and we'll give you the ratio for that. Yeah, it's pretty much just science. You want to make sure you have the acid in the milk and you have buttermilk.
Now, when you measure a dry, wet ingredients, okay, one side is in milliliters, the other side is in cups. That's the part that we're using. Always put it on a level surface, and then come down to what is called eye level. First, I have to know what is it 1 cup?
Yep.
Come down to eye level so that you get an exact measurement, just like you do in science class. And now we have our 1 cup of buttermilk.
Right into that well.
Turn this to the fridge.
You will notice that the buttermilk is thick. It actually smells a bit sour, but that's normal. You want that. So if you're making your own at home and you see that it's getting a little chunky, that's what you want.
You certainly don't want to put buttermilk into your cereal though. Not a good mix, okay? Now you can use your wooden spoon, or you can use your rubber scraper to mix the ingredients together by taking all that flour and making it go into the well so that the buttermilk absorbs all the flour.
There is a secret to mixing biscuit dough. You don't want to overmix, because if you overmix, you'll get very tough, compact biscuits. We're gonna learn about something called gluten in the later weeks of this class, but we don't want tough biscuits, so you really just wanna mix this until the buttermilk has incorporated evenly, and eventually you will see that you have a very wet, sticky dough. This is good, okay? We are going to mix it until it's about this consistency, and then what you're gonna do is actually pour it out onto a floured surface and use your hands to do the rest.
A cutting board that we use, because you don't want to put it directly onto the counter. Take a little bit of flour. I always like to put it in the corner and pull in what you need, because you might need some more or you might not.
So you're just gonna turn this sticky mess right into the middle of that. Using your rubber scraper, which essentially is what you want to use to scrape the sides of your bowl, okay? And that's true for most recipes. Sure.
Okay.
All right.
And the next thing is make sure you have no rings on, no bracelets on, and take a little bit of that flour and actually flour your hands. You want to just very gently fold this and push with the palm of your hand so that this sticky dough becomes a nice soft ball of dough. I'm not adding a lot of flour to it because you don't want them to be dry biscuits, you want them to be moist biscuits. So you can see how now I have a nice ball of dough. Still a little sticky, but it's still workable. Press it down with the palms of your hand. Again, if you're a little sticky, use some of that flour on the board. You will see some bits of shortening and butter in here. That's causing the flakiness of your biscuit, and that's a good sign. Okay. Okay, so it should be pressed down so that it's about a ½ inch thick. You don't want it too thin because you don't want to end up with hockey pucks. Okay, let me just get my hands.
The next piece of equipment we're going to introduce to you is called a baking sheet. And a baking sheet is very similar to a cookie sheet, which would have no sides. This has a little tiny edge around it, so you could use this for a lot of different things, including our Southern biscuits. And you're actually going to notice I have a piece of paper on my baking sheet. Why would you put paper in the oven? Well, because it calls for easy cleanup, really no sticking at all. This is called parchment paper. And you want to make sure you're always using parchment paper if you're cooking in your kitchen. If you didn't have parchment paper, it's okay. You might just have to grease your baking sheet so nothing sticks to it. But like I said, this will allow for non-stick baking and very easy cleanup. And you definitely don't want to use wax paper. Some of you might have that sitting at home. Wax paper it has a wax coating. What happens when you get wax hot? It will melt. So you want to make sure you're not using wax paper. You want to make sure you're using parchment paper. So as you can see, I have my baking sheet lined with a nice even sheet of parchment paper.
Okay, so the next step it's telling you to do is use what we call a biscuit cutter. And a biscuit cutter, you might have one of these at home. These are nesting ones. They come in different sizes. So you can choose to make little mini ones, or you can make the traditional size biscuit that you would get at any of your local restaurants. I think I'll use the middle size one. So we'll put those aside. If you don't have a biscuit cutter, you can take a glass. Same principle, okay? The larger the biscuit cutter, the less biscuits you will get. The smaller the biscuit cutter, the more biscuits you will get. So we'll use this one. You have a little bit of flour on your board. Always try to coat your biscuit cutter with your flour, and then starting at the very edge, you're going to push down and turn and shake it out, and there's your biscuit. And we place them
shoulder to shoulder. Usually when you're making something like cookies, the recipe always tells you to keep them pretty far apart, about 2 inches apart. But because we're making biscuits, we place them shoulder to shoulder since we want them to rise up and not out. having them shoulder to shoulder will help that occur in the oven, okay? So you can see they're not like pushed together or squished together, they're just touching shoulder to shoulder.
And the dough is still a little sticky, which is what you want. Now,
What do we do with all those scraps?
scraps, we throw them out.
Oh, right, okay.
No,
Wait.
no, 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 no. You bring your scraps together, flour your hands a little bit, and proceed to knead this into a nice, smooth, smaller ball of dough.
More biscuits.
Press it down, and I can get 2 more biscuits out of this, and then we still have some scraps. What I like to do with the very last one, roll it together a little bit and kind of pat it down, and it takes on a little shape of its own.
Make your own little biscuit.
And now we have 0 scraps, nothing to throw away.
All on the baking sheet.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so this recipe generally makes about 10 to 12 biscuits. It could make a little bit more if you flatten your dough too much, but you want to make sure you get just about 12, because then you know that you have them the right size. There's one more thing that we need to do before we put these in the oven, and that is just to take your thumb and put a little imprint in the middle of each of your biscuits, just denting slightly. And this is actually going to prevent the tops from doming up in the oven when it reacts with the heat. So doing that will just help to keep a nice even shape for each of these. All right?
Okay, and in the oven they go. My oven has been preheated to 400 degrees. It should say it right on the oven. Stand to the side of the oven, open the oven door, and place these on the top rack. And you set the timer. Now, a little bit about setting timers. It says bake for 15 to 20 minutes. Everybody's oven temperature is different. What do you think I'm going to set the timer for? 15? 20?
What about 17 minutes?
17 minutes? What happens if my oven is a little hot?
Oh, it'll burn.
So, how long should I set the timer for when a recipe gives me a range?
15, the lowest amount that you see.
So I press my timer, I press my up arrow to 15, and I leave it, and in 15 minutes or maybe 16, we'll have some nice biscuits to share with you.
Okay, so we have about 30 more seconds left on our Southern biscuits. Just so you all know, we did check them at 15 minutes, and they needed another 2 minutes. So we added that to the timer, and we are going to be getting them out. But first, we need our wire cooling racks and our oven mitts. These are going to be used to get them out of the oven and then place them on here. You can explain that.
If you don't have oven mitts at home, or maybe you don't like oven mitts, you can use a pot holder, okay? They're insulated. Never use these when they are wet because they produce a steam, which will in turn burn your hand. So I like using my mitts. I'm going to stand to the side of the oven, let all of that 400-degree heat go out, pull my rack out, take out my biscuits, and put them right onto the rack. Close that, and of course I'm going to turn my oven off. How you can go about sliding these right off, because the parchment paper acts as a coolant. If you hold the end of the tray with your pot holder and you tilt it, you can slide them right off like so. See the steam coming out of them? And this can go right on top of your oven.
That could become important because that baking sheet gets really, really hot. So if they're done cooking, you want to get them off the baking sheet so they don't continue cooking on such a hot piece of equipment.
And that's important with a lot of different baked products, especially cookies.
Now what do we do?
Oh, I think it's time to eat them.
Oh, they smell so good.
They do, and they're steaming, and you can pull them apart like so, and then you see that steam, and when you open them up, they're nice and flaky.
Love it.
Whoa.
We will be serving these with some jelly or some butter. Really, they're good just plain though because they have the shortening and the butter in them. All right.
I think we did a great job.
Yay!
Yay!
Elbows.
Elbows.
And
And now we eat. A quarter teaspoon of baking soda. And take your measuring spoon.
It's baking soda. Which I realize I don't think I said baking soda.
Oh, baking powder. Okay, so the first one is baking.
4 teaspoons of this. I know, that's what I mean. I'm like, I'm not gonna remember how to do this. It's okay, we'll start over.
All right, so let's go to. Oh, my
Now
goodness.
we can show them. Oh no! Oh God, violation!
Where did I put? Oh, it's
I
right
feel like I'm looking at myself, and I feel like when I go through this video, you're only gonna be able to see our eyes. Like we have no foreheads. That's